I'm going to ask the Post Board to come forward, Post Board Executive Director Eric Missel and our Post Board Chair, Chief Kelly McCarthy. Please come forward.
Thank you, Chair Mariani and members of the committee. I'm going to give just a brief introduction, and then Executive Director Missel will go into detail with some of the changes that we're making in the Post Board.
Welcome.
When I was first appointed to the Post Board, I was surprised that the Post itself was designed to take a back seat to local control, where other regulatory boards are usually the standard. We're really designed to support the local agency. The need has changed and we failed to change with it. And so what we're trying to do now is we're trying to take apart the car and rebuild it while we're still driving down the freeway. And we're working very, very hard to do that. We also recognize that the commitment to equal justice, there needs to be an urgency, and we have to attack this with the urgency that people's lives require. But when it comes to the policy and the changes, we have to slow down and be very, very diligent. There is so many great police officers in the state doing great work day in and day out. And while it is occasionally disheartening to have conversations like this, we know we're up to the challenge. And too often, before I got to the Post Board, I would hear people say, well, where are all the good officers? You hear from the figureheads of unions and whatnot, but what do the good officers have to say? And so Post, we're really trying to make sure that all of our decisions emphasize and elevate those cops out there that are doing great work and are meeting the needs of their community. And we're going to continue to do that. So I think a good example of that is, we're in uncharted waters here for the Post Board, but an example of that is after the killing of George Floyd, we released a statement, and that ruffled a lot of feathers. It certainly ruffled a lot of feathers in the law enforcement establishment because the Post Board had never done anything like that before. But we understood that this was a different situation, and we understood that the public needed to know that that was not how we trained our officers. They needed that reassurance that this was an outlier and not standard practice. And so we went ahead and did that, and we took some heat for it, but I still believe that it was the right thing to do, and we're not afraid of a fight. And so with that, we'll have Director Missel go into all the real deep changes that we're doing at the Post Board.
Thank you, Chair McCarthy. I look forward to continue our work with you on this important matter. Director Missel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Think the opportunity to come before you again. And I apologize, some of this may sound reminiscent of what we talked about just last week, but I think I'll be able to put a little more flesh in the bones for you. And just a heads up, because as we experienced with my internet here at the office, if I start to get glitchy or something, I will turn off my video so I can stay on.
Oh, good.
All right, so just a quick commentary on some of the things before I get into the meat of what I wanted to cover, or I shouldn't say commentary, but a quick update with regard to, I was reminded as you were going through the legislation, Mr. Chair, that there are a number of things that we have already accomplished and put to bed, so to speak. Primarily, the use of force policy has been disseminated to all the agencies. They've reported back, supplied those copies back to us. The learning objectives for use of force, because of the changes to 609.066 and others, have been updated, as well as the creation of autism learning objectives for pre-service and then eventually continuing education. The warrior style training, we've evaluated a number of courses, and we actually had a couple come in that we have rejected as a result of the statute. So I can report that is in place. And then, of course, duty to intercede and report, which just going back to my experience as a police chief is a critical one that is in place as well, and part of the policy and part of our mandate. So those are the things that I think are relatively buttoned up at this point, and of course we'll continue to update in the future as things as the environment changes. But so with that, I'll go into some of the initiatives and kind of progress where we are in progress, so to speak. As I'd mentioned, we're undergoing a comprehensive overhaul of our rules, the entire chapter 6700, which drives much of what the post board does. Just for perspective, there are 41 sections in the chapter, with numerous subparts that cover basically everything we do, from initial licensing to violations of standards of conduct. Part of the perfect storm of this whole thing, if I put it in that term, in terms of what we've had to address as a board, is that those rules, as an example, have not had any major rulemaking done or updating for at least a decade that I could find. And the last time only dealt with one section, continuing education. So this is a major task that we're undergoing. It involves everything, like I said, across the board, from the initial licensing when someone comes into the system to when they leave. So there's a lot to do there. That is underway. And of course, because nothing operates in a vacuum, that is the changes that will be suggested for rulemaking are directly linked or will be, or have to be, quite honestly, to either work by the Community Relations Advisory Council, by the Rules Advisory Committee. We need to take into consideration the audit that was completed and the recommendations in there. So it's really weaving, I think I mentioned it last week, it's really weaving all those together to make sure that they're working in conjunction with each other, not at odds. So one change in one side of the system requires a change in the other. Secondly, the audit. Speaking of the audit, that is complete, was completed on time and on schedule in September, October. And we're working on reviewing the details of that and the recommendations and then next steps, again, in the context of rulemaking and also the eventual work once we get a little bit further down the road of the advisory council. Included in that audit, in case you didn't have a chance to read it, was continuing education. We're looking at how we vet our courses. I think I've mentioned that before. And one of the recommendations was explore a certified instructor program. Some states do that, where you have instructors that go to a unified, they are taught in a unified manner, and then once receiving that certification from the state, they're allowed to then go out and do the training. We do not have that in place right now in Minnesota. Certification, so to speak, of instructors comes from, whatever, if it's a tool, let's say Taser, the vendor Taser is the one who certifies instructors in how to teach the use of that tool. Of course, incorporating it with current use of force policy, but in my mind, there's some space there and part of the for the board to be involved in that, and it certainly fits well with the recommendations of the audit and also the legislation regarding training. And then, of course, development of a list of providers and courses. Some of this, just so the committee is aware, some of the stuff with regard to training is a little bit backburnered right at the moment because we are primarily focused on the database and building that, and we have that drop dead deadline of July 1st. So much of the training will come into play in the second half of 2021, so we can meet the future deadlines on that. But it's all happening at the same time, and we can walk and chew gum. It's just how fast we can walk while we're chewing the gum. So that's with continuing education. Pre-service education right now, I think I mentioned I'm exploring with some academic institutions and possibly other partners to build a new job task analysis. That was, again, part of the IAD list recommendations, and something we can do right now and really can form the basis for decision-making with regard to training and training curriculum, particularly in pre-service, and that's where it was mentioned. So the idea is that the recommendation, I should say, and our intent is to better define the curriculum for pre-service, define the topics, the amount of time that's spent on it, and maybe even down to the actual That is something that is a little bit more determined by the schools right now. We have developed broad learning objectives, and then they implement the training. I think that has to change. That was clear from the audit, and that's something we will be working on going forward, and is in progress. Finally, in terms of regulatory functions, mandate some minimum background investigation steps. We provided guidelines, and Post has provided guidelines to agencies for some time. And there are some rules in our rules that say, you must do a psychological evaluation that must include an oral interview. But in terms of the background, in terms of how you do a background, how thorough it is, do you do checks? And I don't want to get down in the weeds necessarily, but do you do a financial records check? Do you do a credit check? Are you talking to neighbors? That sort of thing. There are some. It's not new. Tried and true investigative techniques. As a former instructor for background investigations, I know what those are. We don't require that or define that right now for agencies. And I could see part of the recommendation, if we go with the recommendation, would be to perhaps define better what are the minimum standards for conducting a background investigation for police officers when agencies are doing these and looking to hire them. Defining non-criminal conduct better. As the chair is well aware, and I think many of the members of the committee are well aware, we are restricted primarily to criminal convictions in terms of standards of conduct. There are some non-criminal convictions we take action on, but they are limited, and the ones that are there are very broadly defined, such as general misconduct or a misconduct of a public official. The recommendation, I think, something that would help provide some clarity and transparency to everyone is, including us, is to define better what kind of non-criminal conduct qualifies for licensing sanctions. Because right now, and the white supremacy issue is a good one, as most know that have operated in the profession for some time, or any profession for that matter, membership in a religious group or a group, any kind of potential group that you're a member of, where does that then impact your job or your license? People have a right to belong to different things, but of course, obviously, if they're involved in a well-known, identified terrorist organization, different story entirely, right? But those are the things that is that kind of conduct, does that rise the level of requiring licensing sanctions, or is it appropriate for licensing sanctions? So there are some tough questions buried in here, and I don't want to start a whole storm right now. But the fact of the matter is that those are the kind of things that we are going to have to wrestle with as a board and as a profession and as a community going forward. So better defining that conduct in terms of licensing sanctions. Articulating the criteria. One of my frustrations here is taking over this position as a fairly new person in the position is understanding in which situations do I order an investigation? In which situations is it left to the local agency? Or we tell the local agency, do an investigation and report back to us. I have the authority, the board has the authority to order an investigation, but clearly you don't want to do that all the time. And there are certain circumstances where we definitely will, and then other times where we don't. So better defining that again, from the standpoint of transparency and all of us understanding and being very clear about what things the post board will directly investigate and which things they won't, is a critical piece. And part of, I think, some of the misunderstanding of the role of post board through no fault of the public, but through, it's something that we need to define better. We need to clean up our backyard and then present that publicly so people understand better what we do and what we stand for. Very minor recommendation that was brought up, which I think is interesting and something I thought about as an example, and one of the issues that we're considering, again, a change, and it may seem minor, but I think it's important, is that when an officer leaves an agency, right now, we just simply tell the agency, let us know that they left your agency, and if they're going to another agency, what is it? Which one is it? Most as I understand it, most employers or particular licensing will ask for the reason for that person to be leaving employment. Was it a voluntary separation? Is it a retirement? Is it a lateral transfer? Or is it resignation in lieu of, or a resignation for cause, or resignation in lieu of termination? Those are important things, and another facet where there's a potential catch-ball there that maybe is not being caught right now, and is, I think, well within the purview of the post board. Arguably, I haven't broached that with anybody, but I think it's part of just indication of what we're looking at in terms of kind of increasing accountability. Just very quickly, with regard to the complaint database, as a result of the reform legislation, I mentioned we have.
We're gonna have to move very quickly because I'm kind of running out of time. But this.
Oh, you're at 2. Okay.
Yeah, but this is a vitally important issue, so we'll make sure we come back to this at a future date as well. But yeah, just
okay. Okay, I'll just I guess wrap up by saying, again, we're juggling a lot of different things. The complaint database is being built as we speak. At several meetings. We still have our target date of July 1 for that to be submitted. As you mentioned, there are issues potentially with the type of data we're collecting. And I guess with deference to Representative Novotny, who's on the advisory council, because I haven't mentioned this to the advisory council, but one of the things I want to do the next meeting we have is talk about tackling a couple of things in the IAD list audit. And since the council really doesn't have data to work with right now, maybe a good use of getting together and getting moving forward on some of this stuff is to take a couple of those recommendations and provide recommendations to the board, which was, as I understand it, the intent of the council. So with that, I'll cut it off so that you can field questions and whatnot.
Very well. Members, I'm going to do a really hard stop at 2:15. We do have 3 members here. I have questions, but I'm not going to ask them because I want to make sure other members get their questions in. I will just very briefly say that Director and Chair, from my perspective, a breath of fresh air to be able to work with a post board openly and transparently and pulling in the same direction. I suspect we're not always going to agree, but that's fine. I mean, I think the point is that this legislature needs to have the kind of relationship with the post board while respecting its autonomy in the way in which both of you have provided leadership and access for this committee. With that, I'm going to call on Representative Long and then Representative Frazier. We'll cap it off with Representative Lazaro, and it's a hard stop, folks, 2:15. So Representative Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. Thank you so much for your good work on following up on the legislation and in general with moving forward on much needed reform. My question is on the duty to intercede or duty to report. Do those duties only apply for use of force, or do they apply if other illegal activity is observed by officers?
Director Bissell.
That applies to if they observe any use of force, excessive, what they deem as excessive use of force. I'd have to dig into it deeper, I think, but that is pretty much limited to, I shouldn't say limited, but I guess in the context of your question, yes, it's use of force.
Yeah, I actually don't recall myself, but I do believe that's correct, Representative Long.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if it was a sexual harassment or stealing or something else they observed, there would not be a duty to report or duty to intercede.
Not with the use of force policy, which is the context in which this was written. I will say, and I'm sure the chief would agree that most departments will have a set of rules or policies that require reporting of that other conduct that may not fall under the use of force heading.
Thank you.
Representative Long, perhaps some work for us to also do that. Representative Frazier.
Thank you, Chair. Just quickly, first of all, Chief McCarthy, thank you for those words you said up front. Appreciate that. I too, as Chair Mariani stated, breath of fresh air to hear that you want to make these changes and you understand there are changes that need to happen. And I can appreciate the fact that you want to be deliberate about that, so we do it the right way. Hey, quick question around, I know we're emphasizing collecting data, and this may go to Mr. Missile. Do you believe will it make sense, or does it make sense in your estimation, the more data we have, the better we'll be about being preventative in some of these situations that we end up with law enforcement and these bad interactions with community?
Great question, Director Missile.
Yes, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt as to that. The more information you have, the more covers a variety of areas, and you can compare data, one set of data to the other, and create linkages and all that without a doubt. And I was really poor at social research methods in college, but from what I remember, that's a good way to go about it. But yes, I would agree. The catch is always now what data is classified as the chair mentioned, private versus public. Do we want the state, and setting aside the post board for a minute, do we want the state pulling in very confidential internal affairs data from agencies? Maybe we do, but then the question always becomes, and the attorneys will tell you this, okay, now you have it, now you own it, now what are you going to do with it? And then, what liability you're taking on by holding that data. So that's always the balance. But in general, the answer to your question is yes, absolutely.
Very, very well. Thank you, Director Missile. And of course, I've made my posture pretty clear from the beginning. The state has primary duty to ensure human rights are being met. The state is the primary license issuer. And I totally respect, understand, and even appreciate the local jurisdiction issues for effective public safety. But in this chair's opinion, that cannot come at the expense of our licensing authority and/or our commitment to guarantee our constitutional rights to our residents. Representative Lucero, you have the final question or word here, and then we're going to move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I always appreciate conversations, while I may not necessarily agree with certain aspects of them. And I wasn't going to say anything, but something that, just since I'm speaking, I'll bring it up. It's just a little bit disappointing that when in your PowerPoint, Mr. Chair, everything in there were, it was a bipartisan effort, the initiatives that were passed last year, but all the pictures in there were Democrats. And we know that this was a bipartisan measure. It would have been nice to at least acknowledge more of the aspects of Republican contributions as part of that in the PowerPoint in the picture. But the reason I raised my hand here was, Mr. Chair and Mr. Missile, you were kind of mealy-mouthed in regards to white supremacy and then people of faith or religion. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe clarify that, because I was you blew past that, and I want to make sure that you're not equating the repugnant belief system by some of white supremacy with that of people of faith.
Director Missile.
Yep, I think I opened that can of worms, so I better answer for it. Yeah, I was inarticulate in what I said, Representative Lucero. I appreciate you bringing that up. That is not at all what I meant. I just, as a former police chief, I know that there's always that fine line between a person's off-duty conduct or how they represent themselves, whether it's on Facebook or whatever organizations they're part of. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's a religious, a social organization, doesn't matter. I was not equating the two. I'm just saying there's that fine line between a person's First Amendment rights and rights to freely associate. And then where does potentially that association impact how they're viewed in the job or their employer or that sort of thing. That's all I meant by that. I was not drawing a conclusion between the two. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to square that away.
Yeah, actually,
thank you, Mr. Missile, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
No, thank you, Representative Sir. I think it was important to give the director an opportunity to clarify that. And I will. And by the way, thanks for your advice. I'll look for picture for Republicans, and if I ever do another PowerPoint, I think it's maybe only my third PowerPoint in 30 years here. But
Mr. Chair, I could happily provide you maybe a picture to add some color if you want some. I've got a little flair we could add.
yeah, maybe one with that blue hat you've got on, man, which I'm very covetous right now and envious of. I do think that part of this is me personally. I do think that part of what challenges all of us, I would submit humbly, is perhaps not um, a deep enough understanding of racial supremacy and its impact on our society and the white supremacist movement, which has been noted in FBI, advisories and concern for quite a while now, is something that we just kind of keep tiptoeing around. And the better we get to understand it, the more we'll, I think, not confuse that with other, important, belief systems that are perfectly acceptable, for a civilization, whereas this is not. So thank you for bringing that up.